Hi, I'm Dr. Chad Larson. If anything good comes out of a pandemic, it's really accelerating our understanding of how these pathogens interact with our immune systems. Like if you take the HIV/AIDS era, there's a massive increase in research into our understanding the interaction between humans and these pathogens like viruses. And there's a real accelerated learning of how our immune systems interact and all the kind of nuances and the depth and complexity of our immune system. And a similar thing is happening with this current pandemic virus. And there's just a ton of research that is bringing out a lot of new information about how our immune systems interact, how other things influence our risk of a worsening outcome with this particular virus. And what we're understanding is that pre-existing conditions really matter. Current statistics from the CDC website says that about 94% of those who get hospitalized with a severe outcome of the virus have 3.8 underlying health conditions, almost 4 underlying health conditions. And these are things like obesity and hypertension and diabetes and these kind of things. So we're understanding that this sort of acute infection on top of a chronic illness is a major accelerator to a worsening outcome. And there's more and more studies that are coming out trying to explain why is that. And there's an interesting study that was recently published in a journal called Endocrinology. It's through the Endocrine Society, and this is their journal. And it's a great place actually to have this particular information published, because we understand that so much behind metabolic illness, which are these conditions that I just mentioned, these underlying comorbid conditions that could accelerate a person's severe reaction to this virus, that endocrinology is really kind of underlying it, and how the endocrine system, which is basically our hormonal system, influences inflammation and our immune system overall. And so what we're learning is that inflammation is really at kind of the heart of it. And so what's the interaction? How does metabolic syndrome or metabolic conditions influence inflammation? How does that influence the immune system? Here's what this recent published article really discussed. And that is, when inflammation increases, there's a whole cascade of inflammatory chemicals that influence the balance in health and reaction of the immune system. So there's kind of a new term that is being used, which is called meta-inflammation. So it's about metabolic syndrome type inflammation. And this is an unhealthy, kind of dysregulated type of inflammation. And we're understanding that this metabolic inflammation is pretty significantly increased in people who are obese or overweight. And what we understand is that, statistically, something like 30-40% of the US adult population is obese, and depending on what you read, about 70 to 80% of the US population is overweight. So it's a pretty large percentage of the population that have this potential of meta-inflammation. And how does meta-inflammation affect a person's outcome if they get infected with this virus? There's a couple of interesting things that this research indicates. One of them is, and earlier on, a lot of people talked about the cytokine storm. I'm not hearing as much about that anymore, but it's definitely a key feature of somebody who gets a more severe outcome of the virus. And what a cytokine storm is, cytokines are these inflammatory chemicals. We call them cytokines and chemokines, but there's a few specific ones that seem to be particularly implicated in a worsening outcome of COVID. And one of them is called interleukin 6, or IL-6. IL-6 is one of these cytokines that really seems to be majorly upregulated when somebody has meta-inflammation from obesity or one of these metabolic conditions combined with getting the pandemic virus. And what happens is there's already a little bit of inflammation that is understood to be common in people with metabolic syndrome, but when they get infected with a virus, there can be a massive increase in this interleukin 6. In fact, studies showed that an interleukin 6 of greater than 80 picograms per milliliter had a 22-fold increase in respiratory failure. In other words, the respiratory system being so compromised that a person has to, be hospitalized. So a 22-fold increase, that's over a 2,000% greater increase if the interleukin 6 is above 80 picograms per milliliter. So that's a really, really strong correlation between this type of inflammation and a worsening outcome of COVID. And so how does that influence the immune system? Because we're talking about sort of the inflammatory system. Part of the same kind of inflammation dysregulation is there's a very specific part of the immune system that gets involved. If you've had typical blood work, part of your blood work is going to include the CBC, the complete blood count. It's where we have red blood cells and white blood cells, and we have another section called the differentials. The differentials are basically your 5 main white blood cells: neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. So monocytes are a key part of your immune system, and they help to they sort of differentiate, or they morph into another substance called a macrophage. Macrophage means big eater. So if we have a pathogen, a bacteria or virus in the system, a macrophage will eat it. It'll gobble it up. It'll get rid of it. Part of the job is to just get rid of that pathogen. Part of the job is that macrophage becomes what we call an antigen presenting cell. It says, hey, check out this virus that I just gobbled up. Maybe we should do something about this. And that could eventually cause the T cells and B cells to produce antibodies. And this is part of the process of how antibodies are produced, all the way from that macrophage. So this is all good. This is all normal. This is part of a healthy process. However, there's 2 different forms of macrophages. There's M1 and M2. M2 is actually anti-inflammatory. This is a good, healthy, balancing type of macrophage. But if we have too much M1 version of macrophage, this is a very pro-inflammatory process. So part of this immune system, inflammatory system kind of collision, basically, if somebody has metabolic syndrome or obesity or one of these metabolic conditions, there's an undertone already of dysregulated inflammation, imbalance of inflammation. This imbalance of inflammation, when mixed in with a virus, causes these macrophages, which are part of your immune system, to dysregulate. And this could really lead to this kind of cytokine inflammatory storm that could eventually kind of infiltrate the upper respiratory system. And that's how somebody could have, a severe outcome of this pandemic virus. So the point of the study really was that these pre-existing conditions really, really matter. This whole metabolic syndrome, meta-inflammation is really kind of underlying the vast majority of those who have a worsening outcome. So pre-existing conditions really, really matter. Really look to maximize your metabolic health, because this pandemic virus is more endemic at this point. It's just going to be part of our reality. It's going to be part of our culture. And so just to really emphasize how important it is to maximize, improve, and optimize your metabolic health. So I will keep reading the studies and bringing you the information. Until then, keep it real.